All right. Hello and welcome to our first edition of LSU Sports Updates from the Advocate. I'm LSU football and baseball sometimes, and mostly football writer Wilson Alexander, joined today by my colleague, Leah. How are you doing? We're a few days away from kickoff, finally. How does it feel?
I'm so excited. I can't wait to see what's in store for this team.
It's going to be an interesting year, that's for sure. Ryan Kelly's first season at the helm, 16 new transfers, an entirely remade coaching staff. There's who knows exactly how they're going to finish. Projections are really tough to make in college football this year with so many transfers, but it's going to be an interesting year as he kicks off his tenure. Obviously, that starts this Sunday night against Florida State in the Caesars Superdome. Kickoff on ABC in the All-State Louisiana kickoff game. And of course, the big question kind of going into this thing, what we're going to start with today is the quarterbacks. We'll also get to later in the show how LSU's defensive line stacks up against the run game at Florida State, which is probably the key to this game, and also give you an idea of some players to watch who really emerged in preseason camp, guys you should expect to see on the field Sunday night. But let's start with that quarterback question. Leah, we heard from Brian Kelly this Monday that we thought he was going to announce a starter because he said he would announce a starter. And then he didn't, which I guess we should have probably seen coming, seeing as Florida State has already played, and you're not going to want to give anything away tactically, as he said. What was your impression of Kelly's comments, and what do you ultimately expect LSU to do at quarterback?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how close he said the battle was and how he said, that's why he's not announcing the starter, which I don't buy. I think being a first-year head coach and trying to give himself the maximum chance of winning and by making Florida State having to prepare for two quarterbacks, I think that's actually really smart of him. I don't know what you thought of the situation.
Well, what stands out to me about it is the fact that this, like you said, has been in a really close battle. And Brian Kelly has a history of managing multiple quarterbacks. I mean, rarely does he go through an entire season with one guy as a starter the whole year. Sometimes that's because of injuries. Sometimes it's his own decisions. But, like you said, this is an incredibly close battle, has been throughout camp. And just really interested to see, because he said they were both going to contribute this year. Okay, what is that exactly going to look like? You have this history of managing too, but they don't, as he said, actually have, they're not going to change the playbook. And that was actually, I think, probably my biggest takeaway from what he said. It would have been great to hear the starter, but okay, on a deeper level, we've been hearing for so long that, okay, these are different quarterbacks. Jaden Daniels is a runner. Garrett Nussmeier can throw, and really has the stronger arm of the two. And I think that while that's still true, it was interesting to hear Brian Kelly say that they don't have to flip over the play card if they have a different quarterback in there, that this is going to be sort of largely the similar offense, regardless of who's playing quarterback, which if you could give us a quick overview of that offense. You dove into schematically kind of what to expect this year out of LSU, regardless of who's at quarterback. What should we see?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw both quarterbacks in this game, especially for different situations, right? So maybe Jaden Daniels, you want to get some mobility out there. Garrett Nussmeier is the guy who's going to throw it deep, right? And so I think that he's done that in the past with Tommy Rees. One year, he used Tommy Rees as kind of the red zone quarterback where they had somebody else starting. I'm blanking on who it was that was starting. Might have been
Wilson or maybe Christ.
It was Christ. Yeah. And so I wouldn't be surprised if he kind of used them in a situational setup. What Brian Kelly I learned about, kind of funny is he ran that West Coast offense when he was at Cincinnati. And then he kind of turned into this, I'm going to use more tight ends guy at Notre Dame because of the personnel that he was given. And now you kind of combine him with Mike Denbrock, who is known for using multiple tight ends, yet that is not what LSU has. And I think what we're going to see, especially with a young offensive line, is this quarterback is whoever it is going to get the ball out as fast as possible. And he's going to give it to the playmakers, which is obviously your Malik Neighbors, your Kayshon Boutte, your Jack Besh, and let them do the work. And so I think with Jaden Daniels, you'll see some screen passes and stuff like that. I think with Garrett Nussmeier, I think he's going to air it out. So I think that's what we could probably expect to see from both of these guys. And I also think that there's going to be at least one tight end out on the field at a time to help with the blocking, to help with strengthen that, and also add another option in the flats.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what it all looks like. A lot of this has, of course, been taking place behind closed doors, and LSU wants to keep things, under wraps. Last maybe point here about the quarterback, something that just to keep an eye on based on what we've seen in fall camp, is that Jaden Daniels has been the quarterback who goes first, and then they rotate. But this isn't necessarily a shocker because Brian Kelly, unlike a lot of coaches, it actually kind of sets him apart based on the conversations I've had with other folks in the industry, is that he will give the backup about 40% of the reps in practice. Give them valuable time because he wants multiple quarterbacks ready. This is something that he continued to do at Notre Dame. Something I understand that he has done it here at LSU too. So this has been really close. Even some people around LSU maybe don't seem to know who the quarterback is. Joe Gilardi saying yesterday, I don't know how much there is really to this, kind of towing the company line, saying that they haven't even been told yet. We'll see. I think if you've been out at practice every single day like those guys have, you probably know at this point who the quarterback is, and they'll introduce that to the rest of the public, Sunday night against Florida State. That game is going to come down, I think, to the trenches. Florida State, we saw against Duquesne, rushed 54 times for 406 yards and 6 touchdowns. The opponent, of course, has to be taken into account. The Dukes are not at the same level of an LSU or a Florida State in the trenches. But Leah, how much is this defensive line that we've heard so much about at LSU going to really be what determines this game against Florida State and what they want to do offensively?
Yeah, I think it's going to be huge because Florida State has a split back kind of offense. They always have 2 running backs on the field. And they're going to rely on that. Trayshawn Ward is like their number 1 guy. He even averaged 6.4 yards per carry last season. And of course, last week he averaged 9.1 yards per carry and was the leading rusher of the 3 running backs that they had get substantial playing time that contributed to that 406 yards rushing. I think Florida State will probably throw the ball more given the conditions, right? Like they were in a rain delay a lot last Saturday. But they are traditionally a run first team, but they struggled last year with their offensive line, right? So like they led the league with 351 tackles for loss, like against them, right? So that kind of prevented their offense from really being better. And so they have 3 new transfers on that offensive line to kind of give them more depth and more experience, but their run blocking grades were still not great against Duquesne. And I think that LSU's strongest suit, there's a reason why there's 2 team captains on the defensive line, right? And BJ Ojulari, and you've got Jaquelin Roy up at that nose tackle. You got Mason Smith. I think you've got some really physical, but also experienced guys up front who are really going to stop that run game. What are you thinking?
I think the same thing. We've heard so much about this defensive line and seen them up close at different times in the preseason. And Mason Smith just looks like an absolute game wrecker. Physically, I mean, he's 6'5", he's well over 200 pounds, but he's like lean as well. He's explosive. He's got great technique. He's a really good pass rusher. So it is going to be interesting to see. This line's it's strong across the board, but they're also particularly good as pass rushers. So they are going to have to kind of prove that they can stop the run, which was a little bit of a struggle at times for LSU last season, especially think back like the Kentucky game, which was, of course, just a disaster on multiple levels. But there were some other games like that where they kind of struggled to stop the run, especially as the season kind of went downhill. But then, Alabama, they really bowed up in that game. So, they're going to have to prove that just a little bit. But Mason Smith and Jaquelin Roy, it really starts inside with them because, Florida State wants to be able to run up the middle with those formations that you described. And LSU, though, if it can cause havoc in the backfield and push Jordan Travis off his spot when he is trying to make throws downfield, they're going to probably have a good day. The other thing to keep an eye on, I think, just with what LSU might do schematically, we've heard obviously they're very multiple. So 3-man, 4-man front, all that can kind of change around. But within that is Harold Perkins, freshman linebacker. Brian Kelly has talked throughout the preseason about his speed and athleticism. Something you've heard from other coaches and players around LSU is just how much he has flashed here as a true freshman. Not going to be your starter, not going to be your day one starter. That's still probably Mike Jones and Greg Penn at linebacker. But Brian Kelly said during his radio show last week that you could end up seeing Harold Perkins as a spy on Jordan Travis because Jordan Travis has that dual threat ability. And I just think that's something to watch for in this game is how they use Harold, as a rotational player. If they need to really spy Jordan, if he's the one doing that or not, and how he kind of performs in his first game, as a freshman back in New Orleans, where he, as you detailed earlier this preseason, was first born and where he's originally is from. Shifting.
I think we should add too, like this idea of being multiple, right, is a huge Matt House thing. That is something that he got, that he said, he told me that he really took to heart, especially in Kansas City with Steve Spagnuolo. So I think that BJ was talking yesterday about how he is, as the, kind of the jack of the defense, being that hybrid player on a defensive end and linebacker. He's learned a lot more from Coach House about dropping back into coverage and reading coverages. So I think we're going to see a lot of times BJ kind of coming off the line in those past situations. I think that's going to be really interesting to see, is that mix and that ability to be multiple is going to definitely be on display with this dual threat quarterback for Florida State.
Absolutely. And you talk about that jack position. One of the guys who's kind of stepped up here in the preseason as we transition into kind of some guys to maybe look for and really who's shown up. The LSU entered the preseason with just so many position battles. Brian Kelly said the first day of camp that more so than maybe ever in his career, you couldn't pencil guys in any spot because there was these 16 new transfers. This freshman class had come in. LSU, think back to that bowl game, had between 36, 38 scholarship players on the roster. And so there was just so much that was undetermined with the new staff kept seeing these guys for the first time. That this preseason has been really interesting in terms of the position battles. Those seem a little bit more solidified. I mentioned the jack position because Desmond Little is someone who has stepped up behind B.J. Ojulari as a backup for LSU, and Mike Jones Jr. said yesterday that Desmond's really doing some good things. He's added some good weight, and so he's kind of a rotational player to look for on the defensive line maybe at that jack linebacker position. But I think the other one is we start kind of looking at some guys and some overviewing some position battles here and how they kind of ended as we came out of preseason camp. Let's maybe start with the defensive backs. What's the overview of that room right now? It's deep. They brought in a lot of transfers. Who ended up kind of maybe grabbing some playing time in the secondary?
I think what we saw, which we were surprised by, is McNeese transfer Colby Richardson, who, despite the fact that Brian Kelly messed up his name multiple times, has been in there with the number ones or going up against the number one offense the majority of the time. And we don't know if that's because Mekhi Garner has kind of been on and off as far as injury goes. But then you've also got Jarek Bernard Converse, trying to remember how to pronounce that right. That transfer from Oklahoma State obviously brings a lot of experience to that secondary. We've heard Brian Kelly rave about Major Burns as a safety big time, and Greg Brooks as another guy over there. Wilson, can you break down a little bit more about I think you've kind of observed the secondary a little bit more than I have. And so I'm wondering, what is Greg Brooks and some of those safeties, like, what do they bring to the table?
Yeah, Greg's has a ton of experience, having started for, 3-4 years now, about thereabouts at Arkansas. I think it's 3 years at Arkansas. Same thing with Joe Fouché, who's another Arkansas transfer, and Joe might not even be a starter because of Major. Major has really stepped up, coming off of a lower leg foot injury last season that kept him out all the way through the spring. He's shown up as one of LSU's sort of maybe biggest risers in camp. LSU loves the way he communicates because he processes what he sees really fast and then gets it out to guys to where they need to be, which is obviously crucial in the secondary. But Joe and Greg bring a lot of experience. And then Jay is pretty athletic, former cornerback who they then moved over to safety a couple of years ago. Has really, no doubt that he'll be a starter kind of at that maybe free safety position because of his ball skills and then what Major does with his communication. It is, like you mentioned, the corner is going to be really fascinating because Sevyn Banks, who came from Ohio State, somebody they really liked, it took him a while to kind of get cleared. And so he hadn't been a full participant for the entirety of camp. And so he was mostly running with the twos. Jarek is definitely your starter at wide field corner. The short field, I guess, probably comes down to Colby or Mekhi. But like you said, Colby Richardson, maybe if he's not a starter, he's going to be a key rotational piece on this team. Switching over to some other positions, though, let's hit on them quickly on the offensive side. Offensive line has been set. We know what it's going to be. Will Campbell at left tackle, left guard Miles Frazier, center Garrett Dellinger, right guard Anthony Bradford, right tackle Cam Wire with Tremont Shorts as kind of your first person off the bench at guard. I'm wondering who else has stood out to you offensively and kind of really rose and caught your attention during camp.
Yeah, I think the running back room is deep, and I think it's understated. Noah Kane certainly adds that veteran element. I also felt like he was breaking tackles a lot of times. He's kind of that up the middle guy kind of guy. I felt like he always was getting positive yardage. He was very consistent. And I know that he's been a huge leader on this team. And I know how much he wanted to come here. I wrote a story about him earlier in camp and being a Louisiana native and kind of taking the long road. And he's coming off an injury he's 2 years removed from an injury, but it definitely impacts him last season. So I think he has a lot to prove. Armani Goodwin has also taken substantial snaps, even with the first team. We saw a little bit of him last year. I think he has a little bit more speed, actually. I think he's kind of the guy who can go around the edge. You can kind of use him as a receiving back too. And then you've got Josh Williams and some of those other guys, but I really think those two, Noah Kane, Armani Goodwin, we're going to see a lot out of. And, the wide receivers, I feel like they speak for themselves. We know that Malik Neighbors has been training more in that slot receiver position. And we've seen some pretty athletic plays by him that have really stood out to us substantially, almost more than Kayshawn, I will say. Like, he's kind of been able to break a lot of guys that are trying to bring him down and making these huge plays. He's got a vertical that's kind of unbelievable. I don't know. I know it's a hot take, Wilson, but what do you think about this wide receiver room?
That is a hot take. The thing about it is Kayshawn's going to attract so much attention from defenses that it will probably open up things for Malik, for Jack Besh, for Jory Jenkins. And it's also going to be interesting, and Kelly was talking about this today with that receiver room, that, Malik has moved to the slot, and that's been beneficial for him because he is really talented and looks like he's primed for a breakout year. One other thing to mention about him before we move on is just Brian Kelly said today he'll be the kick returner and the punt returner, that he's just been, really had a really, really good camp. But even with Malik kind of maybe starting out in the slot, because we have seen a lot of him there, they're going to be able to move those receivers around, especially with Jack Besh coming back now healthy from the shin splints that were keeping him out for really over half of camp. He's back, he's fine. And so now, because you have that secondary option, and sort of that he's kind of like that fourth guy, you can move different pieces around, even Kyron Lacey and Brian Thomas Jr. and Chris Hilton, who I probably haven't mentioned yet. That receiver room is stacked. There's going to be a lot of games where they could break just the top off of defense, and that's certainly going to be the strength of this offense. One thing to mention, though, Mason Taylor at tight end is another person who we all heard a ton about during camp. Brian Kelly even compared him to Georgia tight end Brock Bowers, who had an incredible freshman year with 13 touchdowns and over 800 yards receiving. It'll be interesting to see exactly what Mason Taylor does. That's a lot to put on a guy who has not played a college snap yet. But like you said, LSU wants to use the tight ends, and Mason has given them a lot more confidence at that spot, just because they feel better about the depth and what they have there now with his ability as a pass catcher. He looks really fluid running in and out of routes and seems to have pretty sure hands. So 6'5", 245-pound freshman to keep an eye on as well there, along with Cole Taylor and Jack Mashburn. Any other sort of things that you're really just looking for kind of going into this game before we address some questions?
I'm interested to see I think if we go back to defense, I'm interested to see how much they cycle the linebackers. I feel like that along with the defensive line is the most deep position. And I like this idea of Harold Perkins, like maybe being that spy guy. I think West Weeks we've seen a lot out of that transfer from Virginia. We keep forgetting, but he's also come in a couple times with Mike Jones. So I'm really interested to see how the linebackers stack up in this defense that is going to be very multiple, and we're going to have to try to figure out.
Absolutely. Well, we got some questions, or one question to answer. So we'll take this from Kenny C. Appreciate the question, Kenny. He said, UCLA manhandled LSU in last season's opener, setting the tone for a terrible season and changing the way the college football world looked at the LSU program. To what extent is that driving Coach Kelly's approach to this game, including personnel and schemes? This is kind of an interesting topic, I think, just because LSU, they got manhandled in that season opener. It set the tone for the whole year. But I don't think that's something that's necessarily on Brian Kelly's mind, because he was the head coach at Notre Dame last year. But it does sort of set the tone for the program in a way. LSU came out of that game, and you could tell it was an auspicious start, and you could tell, okay, this might not be a good year, and there's probably going to be a coaching change at some point if it continues down this path. Personnel-wise and schematically, this has been a complete and total overhaul. So there's not much you can take away from that game. It's more so I just feel like tone and vibe, which is around the program, which is, sort of an abstract kind of thing. But, how important do you think it is really for LSU to get off to a win here to start his tenure? I mean, is it vital, absolutely vital, that they win this game against Florida State? You've got a tough second half of the SEC schedule in particular down the road, a really muddled kind of SEC West. If they don't win this game, are they in a bad spot? Or is this kind of at least gives you a chance to see what you have? And if you lose, maybe you can take away some things from that anyway.
Yeah, I think what's most important, what's vital is that they compete well. If they end up losing in a close game, I know that LSU fans are not keen on losing. I think that would be a little bit more encouraging than like an all-out blowout by Florida State. I think it's going to be a win for LSU, but you can never be too sure. I'm sure y'all were shocked by the performance last year at UCLA. I wouldn't say that any history comes into play as far as this coach's decision. I will say, though, the fact that he's not naming a starting quarterback, I think that might have something to do with, again, he's going to take every advantage that he has to set the tone with a win, obviously, and to set the tone for a successful season. So I think that's played into why, Brian Kelly has been so quiet about starters at certain positions. Like you said, some of the stuff that we've seen with the ones have been the first team has been kind of a mix. And so I think he's really trying to keep a lot of what he's got quiet because he has that advantage as a new head coach.
Yeah. And to go back to Kenny's question as we kind of wrap up here, just that idea of the way the college football world looks at LSU's program, the last 2 years were not good. I mean, 11 and 12 of the last 2 years. It's probably why the biggest win total has been 7 games. LSU was picked to finish in the bottom of the SEC West. There's a lot to prove for LSU this season, a lot for Brian Kelly. This area is an element to him coming in here and wanting to change perceptions around how the college football world views LSU instead of a place that's kind of up and down, occasionally and volatile, and has this great year in 19 and then just collapses the next 2 years to make it really steady, constantly competing for championships and really well respected across the board in terms of how they do things. And so, that starts out with this game against Florida State, obviously Sunday night there in the Caesars Superdome, sold out game officially as of today. So it's going to be a great atmosphere. Really kind of feels like college football is back from, pre-pandemic kind of. Even last year, you could still sort of feel like that was lingering around at times in terms of the crowd levels and things like that. And now it's okay, we didn't have access like we did, pre-pandemic until midway through last season. So now it's okay, this feels like college football again, and I certainly can't wait. Last word, Leah, what you got?
Yeah, I'm just excited to get started, and I'm excited to cover a game in the Superdome. I've never done that.
Well, bring a jacket. The press box gets really, really cold because the air vents are right above them. But it's going to be great. We'll have everything covered for you at theadvocate.com, NOLA.com. Find Leah on Twitter at LVan_sports.
Yes.
Did I get it right? Awesome. I'm at WHAlexander_ as well. Subscribe to our newsletter. We have LSU stuff for y'all every single day, and we'll have you covered throughout the season. You can find this show 2 p.m. right back here every week as we kind of go through the season, previewing games and what's the latest with LSU football. So thanks for watching, everybody. Hope to see you again next week. And for now, that's all from the Advocate's LSU Sports Updates.